What is going on, Hive Warriors? So today I'm super excited to share that there is a brand new meta-analysis, full-blown systematic review. But this one is novel. This one is different than all the other ones. Remember how in the previous video where I was talking about intermittent fasting and which one was the best, that the studies consistently show that the one that has the most success rate is the 16-8 diet, or for some, the time-restricted feeding diet, where the timing is around 16 hours of fasting, but with 8 hours of eating. That tends to give the best results in comparison to all the other ones, right? When compared with the 5-2 diet or alternate day fasting diet, or what have you, or 1 meal a day, the 16-8 tends to be the most successful one. And every time we've had a meta-analysis, even the ones that have shown positive results for the fasting group versus the normal diet group, what ends up happening is that it's a mixture of different intermittent fasting protocols. Like you'll see the 5-2 or the 1 meal a day or the 16-8 or all of those different ones. They're all mixed in, and all of the mixed in ones are competing with just the normal diet. But for the first time in studies, in terms of meta-analysis, which is the highest pinnacle of study design. So no one can come and say, well, this one individual study refutes that study, therefore that study is not as powerful as this individual study. No, because what a meta-analysis is compiling all of the different studies, putting them together, making sure they hit certain criteria. Like this one wanted to ensure that it had a normal diet group, that it was a controlled study with a control group, and that it was looking at fat mass reduction and even performance, physical performance, and looking at fat-free mass reduction or increase, which was basically anything other than fat, which will insinuate your muscle reduction or things of that nature. So it looked at this, but it also, for the first time, did a full-blown meta-analysis where it only focused on the top tier intermittent fasting protocol, which is the 16-8. Now, again, I don't do the 16-8, so it isn't a bias where I'm like, 16-8 is the best one because I do it. I'm just simply basing it off of the studies. And I've read hundreds and hundreds of studies on intermittent fasting. The 16-8 is the most consistently positive result one out of all of them. So this group of researchers decided to, hey, let's go ahead and do a meta-analysis dedicated to just time-restricted feeding, dedicated to the 16-8, and we'll see how this goes up against normal dieting. And the results are magnificent. This is something that I theorized would happen when they finally put together a meta-analysis only using time-restricted feeding, or the 16-8. So this study was published in the National Library of Medicine via the National Center of Biotechnology Information, and it was published on August 28th of 2024. So this is brand spanking new. It was published by Ki-Wen Wang and colleagues, and it is a comparative effects of time-restricted feeding versus normal diet on physical performance and body composition in healthy adults with regular exercise habits, a systematic review, and meta-analysis. So what exactly did they find? Well, to not hold you up for so long, so you just know right off the jump. We're going to show some charts and show the differences, but just so you know right off the jump, we'll read the results exactly. 15 randomized controlled trials with 361 participants were included in the systematic review in comparison with the normal diet group. Time-restricted feeding significantly decreased body weight and fat mass. No between group differences in physical performance related variables and fat-free mass were found. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that there was a significant difference between the normal diet group and the time-restricted feeding group only when it came to weight loss and fat loss. When it came to those two things, there was a significant difference between the two. But the even better part, because I think this is a pretty optimal way of using intermittent fasting. You're not fasting too long where there's muscle breakdown, but you're also not fasting too short where you're not getting any significant advantages. You're fasting within the just right time frame for most people. So what ends up happening is you're getting the benefits of the fat loss that comes from fasting, and you're not getting into that gluconeogenesis where you're breaking down muscle. Therefore, the muscle, the fat-free mass, that remained the same. Their performance, their aerobic performance, their physical performance in the gym when doing exercise, that remained the same. There was no significant difference. There wasn't a big drop off with the time restricted feeding group or a surge with the normal dieting group. It was exactly the same. It was the same between both groups. And that's fascinating, because to me, I've always wondered, when putting all of these studies together, does that still show that there's like a strong case for fasting still even superseding normal diet when it comes to even physical performance, or bare minimum staying right with them, where you could choose to do intermittent fasting and it might actually just be overall more optimal regardless of what you're doing. If you're trying to maintain muscle and lose fat, intermittent fasting is probably the most optimal. And that's what's being shown here in this meta-analysis. Now, if we look at the charts, so in terms of the fat mass, you can see this diamond here is showing the average across the board, right? And this diamond here is also showing, so this is showing the subtotal and the overall in terms of the average across the board for all of these different studies. Some looking at more than 8 weeks, some looking at less than 8 weeks. This line right here is right in the middle between the normal diet group, which is on the right, and the intermittent fasting group, which is on the left. And you can see all these different dots are all the different studies and the significant differences in between both groups. And you can see a lot of the dots over here. These long lines, if you're wondering, these are the possible ranges, right? Because nothing is absolutely perfect. This is based off of averages and the ranges of the total amount of participants. So these are the ranges, but you'll see that the averages are the dots, and they are more in the left side than they are on the right side. And when compiling everything together, the average that we get is right here for the subtotal and the overall, meaning that this overall subtotal and everything, putting all of these studies together, intermittent fasting, or specifically time restricted feeding, the 16-8, if you will, is more powerful than just normal dieting. It's more powerful than just normal dieting. This is absolutely impressive. So this is a super powerful meta-analysis. 361 participants across all of the studies that were selected. I believe they did about 2,680 different studies, but if they didn't meet the criteria, which is it had to be randomized controlled, it has to be TRF specifically. If it didn't meet all of that, they were filtered out, and it needed to also show that the exercise portion of it, the body composition portion of it, with both fat-free mass and fat mass reduction. It needed all of that stuff. And when when they computerized all that, they went through PubMed, they went through different types of other search or other libraries that hold studies. They went through all of that. They came out with 15 that hit all of those markers that they needed, where it was TRF and it was controlled with a normal dieting group. And these were the results that they received. Now, everybody who's tried to say, no, intermittent fast is not that big of a deal, you don't need to do it, what's the point of intermittent, just do all these people that are super gung-ho on study design, let's see how many of these people will talk about a randomized controlled trial meta-analysis systematic review that extrapolated the data of a TRF study or of the TRF protocol versus normal dieting. Let's see how many of those people actually talk about this study, because whatever study they've talked about in terms of intermittent fasting, I guarantee you was not more powerful than this study design. This is the hierarchy of study design, taking multiple studies and creating one study out of all of those studies. This is the pinnacle. This is the top of the pyramid in terms of the most potent study that you can use to get an idea of what is more than likely happening. And from a 16-8 specific only, as it championed itself versus normal dieting in a massively successful way by basically showing that you don't lose muscle, you don't lose your physical performance, yet you still lose more fat, more body fat, and you still lose more weight than just the normal dieting group. Now, even though some of these did control for calories, some of them didn't, some of them did, some of them didn't, that's not the point. The point is, if you actually decide to do intermittent fasting, and let's say you are controlling for calorie, then you're more than likely going to be more successful with TRF. Let's say you try to do choose to do intermittent fasting and you're not controlling for calories, you're not really paying attention, you're still more likely to be more successful than normal dieting. Even if somebody wants to go into each individual studies and figure out how many of them are controlling for calories, how many aren't, how many whatever, you don't escape the fact that within the groups, even though maybe calorie isn't controlled for some of them, they still find more success without controlling for calories explicitly when they're doing intermittent fasting, as opposed to just creating a normal diet system. That is super, super powerful. So as these studies continue to come out, and I had a very strong theory and a hypothesis that this would happen if we had the 16-8, because as I mentioned, the 16-8 seems to be that point where most people biologically aren't over fasting, and most people biologically are getting through that threshold where they're in that metabolic switchover and they're burning body fat for fuel. They're turning their fatty acids into ketones via the liver through the process of beta hydroxybutyrate. And they're getting that benefit from fasting, but then they're cutting it off right before that glucose neogenesis phase, right? Where they're consistently burning or breaking down muscle. I feel like the 16-8 hits that perfect middle ground. And I always wanted to see a meta-analysis just focus on the 16-8, but I felt that it wouldn't happen because it would be too, I don't know, I feel that there's people that kind of already understand that the 16-8 is pretty powerful when it's standing alone, right? And sometimes when they just mix in the 16-8 with like the 5-2 or alternate day fasting, and some of those studies are not as powerful or not as consistently positive as the 16-8, is going to bring all the numbers down overall for the fasting umbrella, because the 16-8 is being mixed in with all these other diet systems. Why not take the one that is the most successful consistently across all studies and then put that solely in a meta-analysis, systematic review, randomized controlled trial system design versus normal dieting, and see what happens? We finally did that, and boy, intermittent fasting comes out as the big winner in this study. Hit up all of these other anti-intermittent fasting channels, or the channels that pretend that they're pragmatic. Hit them all up. Let them know, hey, bro, talk about this study. I will link this study down in the description box below so you guys can look at it for yourself, and you can also send that study to those other channels so that they can look at this study and make their videos on this study. I'm very curious to see their take on this as well, because I have a sneaking suspicion that they won't talk about this study, because this is just too damning for a lot of people. It is a meta-analysis. You can't say, well, this is just a single study. It is the top of the top of study design, and then it's also using randomized control trials, and it's also just looking at the 16-8 and not looking at all these other ones, or looking at time restricted feeding and not looking at all these other ones. I think this one is super powerful, guys. This is probably the most powerful study we have ever had on intermittent fasting's positivity over normal dieting. Anyways, let me know what you think down in the comment section below. And until the next one, peace out.